Morning. It's good to have everyone here. Say happy Father's Day to all of our fathers. You're a great encouragement to me, and I know just being a part of the church here, we get to be a great encouragement to one another. So we are continuing our study looking at the book of Acts, specifically in our sessions. This is session number 3 out of 4, so you get to kick me to the curb and get somebody else in here. But we're looking at the context to the content and looking at the book of Acts and understand a little bit more historically what's going on around what we're reading, as you're going to be continuing on in this series of lessons, starting with in 2 weeks, where you're going to be looking at the conversions and the sermons in the book of Acts. What we're just trying to do is add some context around that. So when you see certain terms and what I'm trying to accomplish, look at certain people groups, you know exactly what's going on there, maybe have an idea of how they think. And so that's what I'm trying to contribute to. As we've looked at overview of thinking about, geographically what's going on during this time, so that you have a little bit of a map in your head, and maybe even if you have a map in the back of your Bible, you can go there. Understood a little bit more last week, looking at the influence of the Romans and what's happening politically and a little bit religiously what's going on. We're going to dive in a little bit more to these individual groups so that when we conclude next week, we're going to take the things that we've been studying for the past 3 weeks and apply them to our current setting, because I think that's the most appropriate way. Anytime we're going to read a book from the Bible, we want to understand what was going on and figure out where we need to align. And so if we can understand historically what's happening during that time, we certainly can know how to interpret that and how to translate it over to where we are today. As I go through the book, I keep finding as Luke and as God's trying to teach us through the book of Acts how to understand people. I think that's probably one of the things that we can get from it. Overarching theme is, all right, let's see what Jesus did, what he began to do and teach with the book of Luke and the gospel accounts essentially, and then let's see the spread of Christianity. But what I find over and over again in the book of Acts is just working with people, right? I mean, that's the church, is that we are all part of the people business. We are working with one another. I hear it said over and over again, think about all of our different stories and our context and where we're from. The likelihood of all of us being in a room like this is, astronomical if it wasn't for the church. And I enjoy those kind of interactions that we have, and just a reminder of how encouraging it is that we come from all different parts of life and different upbringings, and we could go around and we could tell some of those influences in our life. We can talk about where we've been and what we've gone through and our families, and talk about in a very positive way things that we've experienced, but also we could say the negative things about where we've come from and things that we've experienced in our family, and we get to add all of that in here, and I think that's what makes the church unique, but it also helps us build up together. We get that encouragement, right, when we come into this room and you start hugging one another and checking in on one another and see how things are going. That's what the church is all about. And so when I read the book of Acts, I find people coming together out of the world and into the church, into Christ. And so just if you have that rotation in front of you, just so you know, this is mostly for me where I need to be next, but you can find out who's going to be in here. John Kackelman III will be in here in a couple of weeks. I'm thinking about Acts chapter 24. In Acts chapter 24, you're toward the end of the book, and it narrows in on Paul and where he is in his conversations with people. All right, we've been following the spread of Christianity. The first 8 chapters, started us from Jerusalem, fulfilling the Acts chapter 1, verse 8 outline. You have Jerusalem, Judea, going into Samaria, into chapter 8. Chapter 13 starts Paul's missionary journeys, and so you're watching Paul interact with all these different groups. And then toward the end of the book, specifically around chapter 21, if you want to go think about it from there, you're going to narrow in on Paul and where he goes to the end of his life. And I think it's interesting, if you flip over to the end of the book of Acts, it seems like it ends abruptly, doesn't it? Similar to we were talking about in VBS this week with the story of Jonah. You get to the end of Jonah and you're like, am I missing a chapter? Because it kind of ends abruptly. But I think it leaves us, in a sense, on a cliffhanger, thinking about what is going to come next. Now, we know through tradition and a few other things about Paul and what was going on during that time. He dies in Rome, and we're not going to spend our time thinking about that, but I want to consider what Paul was doing, at least in that last part of his life. You're going to follow Paul through his trials. not to parallel on even ground with Jesus in his trials, but there are some things that we can take away what Paul was going through when he does, in a sense, go through Jewish trials, very similar to what Jesus went through. He went through the Jewish trials in Caiaphas' house, and they accused him. They accused him of blasphemy, which is the main thing they hated. But to get the Romans on their side, they accused Jesus of rising up against the Romans, and we dealt with that a little bit. In very similar fashion, Paul is going to be accused of similar things. You're going to see his preaching being laid on the table. This is what Paul's been preaching. This is what he's trying to convert us to do. This is what he's trying to train us to do. And then Paul appeals to Caesar, so he can politically appeal to that, so he doesn't have to deal with the Jews. He gets to bypass some of those things, and he's going to go to Rome, and he's going to have to deal with all the things that are going to happen there. But we're certainly thankful because of the spread of Christianity and many other influences that he had. But when you get to Acts chapter 24, and toward the end, Paul makes a defense for his belief, where he's come from and what he's experienced. How did he end up standing in front of the same people that he was on the other side of the table with? Isn't that fascinating? Just think about the story arc of Paul, where he came from and being on the opposite side. And once again, we talked about this in VBS and thinking about his conversion. But everywhere he went, he gave a defense for Jesus. Specifically for Paul, he met him on the road to Damascus. Changed everything about him, a complete 180. Going over to Christianity, but the same momentum that he had for Judaism. I mean, we see that he was zealous from a young man all the way up, learning about Judaism and following after these teachers and, even giving name and credentials. The same momentum that he had, he just moved that over to Christianity, and you see that same type of trajectory in his life. But as he's making all these defense and people that he interacts with, and I'm here in Acts chapter 24, looking at verses 14 through 15, Paul's saying, but this I confess to you, that according to the way, which is a reference to Christianity, you see Christianity be mentioned over and over again as the way, which they call, speaking about the Jews and the people he's talking with here, that they call a sect. I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets. Very similar to what Luke said in Luke chapter 24 when Jesus was speaking and said that I came to fulfill the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Okay, so he's saying, look, I can go back and I can look at all these things, believing everything in the law and the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. I think there's a lot of similar phrase here that you can find, references to Jesus in Luke chapter 2, verse 52, where we see Jesus growing in stature and favor with God and men. It's kind of a reoccurring theme, and I think we get a precedent set with Jesus that Paul himself is going to follow, and one that we need to step on board with as well. But looking at what Paul is saying here, I think helps us understand as we interact with people, what was Paul believing in, and who was he interacting with, and how did that influence where he's standing in this moment? And he traces these things back, and he's talking about, all right, I can tell you why I'm a Christian. I can tell you why I'm on this path. Now, he's going to try and bring them over as well and convince them. But every time you read through the book of Acts as well, you're going to find people put on trial. Some of them specifically are going to be put on trial in front of people. They're going to be beaten. They're going to be persecuted. They're going to be put in jail. They're going to be killed. Other people are put on trial when their family is going to be standing in front of them, and they're going to have to give a defense of why they have changed over from the rest of their family. It reminds me of a conversation I was just having this morning, thinking about people that sit in these pews and previously have sat in these pews, and they were the only Christians in their family. And what a strong message that is for us trying to live our lives faithfully, that we have examples of other people that said, I'm the only one in my family that wanted to be a part of the church and serve God and do what the Bible actually says. When you read the book of Acts, you've got examples of that. You have households that are turning over to God, but then you also have the persecution of that entire house by their own fellows around them, the city overthrowing them. And we could do that over and over again, but we find examples of Paul, where it seems like he's literally by himself except for his friends that he makes in Christianity. Everyone else abandons him, and he's trying to interact with them. So, basing off where we were last week and going a little bit more in depth. In Revelation 7, 9 through 10, I think this is a beautiful picture as well. And we can see this in other times where Jesus talks about the final judgment, and in other scenes where we can think about standing before the throne of God. In Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 and 10 says, "After these things, I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and all people and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands. And they cry out with a loud voice, saying, 'Salvation to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb.'" Isn't it going to be a beautiful scene when we get to heaven, and there are people from all over the world praising God in one united tongue, not saying one necessary language. That's not what I'm saying. All of us saying the same thing. Salvation belongs to our God and to the Lamb. Anyone who is a Christian, and I'm going to say believer, those who make that confession, but we know all the things that is involved in becoming a Christian, hearing the Word of God, believing in it, repenting, confessing, being baptized into Christ, and then rising and walking in newness of life. But just overarching, because we can talk about those who confess Christ. Matthew chapter 10, 33, verses along those lines. Isn't it fascinating that anybody who is a Christian, from beginning all the way to where we are and whenever Jesus is going to come back, when we all stand before the throne of God, every knee is going to bow, right? And that's what Philippians chapter 2 says. All people. There's not a single people group, there's not a single individual that doesn't have the ability to be there. It just depends on if they're going to submit themselves to God and put their will to the side. But man, how beautiful is that going to be? Thinking about this scene in heaven, surrounded all around the throne of God, all glory goes to Him, but it's because of the Lamb. And when you read the book of Acts, I want you to have that in your mind. This beautiful scene, and you're seeing it unfold in ways that we didn't get to witness necessarily as you read through the narratives of the Old Testament. Now, it's certainly there. You find converts, what we're going to, and I'll give you some terms in just a moment, but what we're going to call proselytes from different walks of life. They come over to have a belief in God. And just to keep attaching to VBS, you think about Rahab. You have this woman in Jericho in a pagan land living a lifestyle of prostitution completely away from practices that just doing things that are unacceptable, but you find her heart melting within her when she hears about what the God of the Jews, our God, the one God, is able to do. Her heart melts within her, and she says, "Our whole family's coming over." And you find her being a part of the family of Christ. Without her, the lineage of Christ, certainly God would have accomplished that. That's not what I'm saying. But you find her, in the story, very important for us being able to get to Jesus. So isn't that fascinating? As you read through the book of Acts, just encouragement, I guess, is probably one of the best ways to think about it. Things that you see bringing us over to where we are. I think there are three things that just for you to be aware of that I've tried to attach to as we've gotten to this point. If you're reading the book of Acts, you want to find out regionally where people are from. All right, I gave you the outline, starting in Jerusalem, right there in the epicenter of Christianity, but also Judaism itself, and many other things begin in Jerusalem, and then it blossoms out from there. But someone's geographical location tells us a lot about the way that they think. All right, here we are in the United States. In the South, we got some good friends that are from the North, and geographical location says a lot about the way that we talk, things that we enjoy, even our food and customs and things like that. And you can certainly see that as you're reading through. So region is important. Religion is important. This is a main part of what we call someone's worldview, how they view themselves, the world itself and how it operates, but also other people. Somebody's religion is going to tell us a lot on how they think the world came into existence. We believe that God created all mankind in His image, so that makes us all, as unique as we are, we're all the same. And we appeal to that, don't we? When we look at other humans and we think about treating one another with dignity and respect, because it doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter your geographical location. It doesn't matter your ethnicity. It doesn't matter your race or anything else, that we're all equally created in the image of God. And all praise and glory and honor goes to God. But someone else's religion may have these people groups divided out a little bit more. Someone else's religion's they're not going to say that mankind is created by a loving creator. Maybe they have different characteristics of this creator, and maybe He's not a creator. He did something else to bring about the existence of mankind, of humanity. and I would say it's even a religion, a different type, but someone that is an atheist, a naturalist, they're going to say that, humans, we just evolved into where we are today, and we'll evolve into something else potentially down the road. That's still part of a worldview. And as you're reading the book of Acts, if you can pinpoint someone's religion, it'll come out in their conversation. That'll give you a head start to be able to deal with them. And finally, their reason, the way they think. When we sit across the table from somebody, sitting down and getting a cup of coffee, or across the dining room table and just having conversation, you learn about how people think. Sometimes that scares us, how somebody gets to certain conclusions. But overall, right, we want to know, I want to know why you think the way that you do. If people have differing beliefs on religion, somebody has different beliefs on just customs and practices and etiquette, it's like, why do you think that? I think that's so important for us to consider. But if you can understand how somebody has gotten to their personal beliefs, how somebody processes just the way that they just see life, they see themselves, if you can get to the bottom of that, then you can start leading them down a path to Christ. And I think this is why we find examples over and over again in the book of Acts, Paul hitting each one of these areas. He wants to know how people think. That's why he spends time with them. Ask them pertinent questions. Jesus did the same thing, and we need to do the same thing. Anytime we come across somebody, if we're having in mind, how can I get them to Jesus? Every question that we ask, we're wanting to know how they think so that we can think like them to help them and navigate them a little bit more. But as we're going through just understanding the context of the content, I think this is important for us to look at all three parts of where people are coming from. So as we piggyback off of last week and go into this week and understanding these different groups, what I want to do this morning, we're going to look at some varieties of Judaism. We've already made mention to them, but I want to walk through parts of the book of Acts just so you can see where they pop up. And so the things that we've discussed already, you can start saying, oh, that's what's happening here. This is what's going on. And how did we end up where we are today? All right, so let's look at, we mentioned high priest. The high priesthood is very different in the first century than it was when Judaism first started. Now, you're going to have, thinking about the high priesthood, Moses when he was on Mount Sinai, and having Aaron as the high priest and all that kind of stuff, right? We're going to start there. But then you find, if you were to follow the priesthood through the Old Testament, and then what we're going to call the intertestamental period leading us over into the New Testament, you've got Aaron and you've got Nadab and Abihu, his first sons that he was going to pass on this priesthood, and you find them not doing it correctly. So they're out of the way. And then you keep having, if you keep reading through the Old Testament, you find the priests that are supposed to be these good religious leaders that are to help you and the people worship God correctly. It has always fascinated me, and just the amount of pressure that was put on just the priesthood in general. There was a responsibility. If you wanted to go worship God, you needed to know the rules about what you needed to bring to God, right? Especially if you're coming from a whole nother city and you're packing up your home and you're going to be gone for 7 to 10 days. And you're, for all of you that like a checklist of what I'm supposed to bring with me. But if you're wanting to know, all right, if we're about to head out and I need to know what kind of sacrifice to bring with me, because I've got all my flock, I'm not bringing them with me. I've got to leave them back here. So what am I looking for specifically? So they had to go through and, look at their inventory, and they're going to come miles and miles to Jerusalem, and they're going to have to figure out, do I have the correct sacrifice? And thinking about going to Jerusalem, talking to the priest, and that's the second part of it, they're going to examine the sacrifice to see if it's worthy to be offered to God. Because if they offer something incorrectly that you have brought, there's double accountability. I think that is so fascinating, the responsibility the priest had to help people worship correctly, and the worshipers themselves running in tandem, helping one another. But think about that, if they were to offer something that had spot or blemish, although somebody brought it, they're going to be held culpable for it. The high priest is the one that's, kind of orchestrating everything. But what happens from the time of Aaron and beyond that, you find people not really living up to the standard. Nadab and Abihu were the first examples of that. But over and over again, you find people not living up to the correct standard. You find certain lines being cut off because of their generations, because of what people did, thinking about Abiathar with David, and then moving over to Zadok, the priest. If you want to read a little bit more about that in 1 Samuel chapter 1, starting there, you certainly can. But the high priests are important. But what happens from the time of Aaron and beyond, they start becoming a little bit more of a political leader. And I think I mentioned in passing that they serve more as like the godfather role, that they are ruling people when that should be another part of God's theocracy, specifically his word. All right, but then you had the kings and stuff come after that. But look at the times in the book of Acts where people interact with high priests. Let's look at Acts chapter 4. And I'm just looking at a few verses in the midst of it. You certainly can read the full context on your own. But in Acts chapter 4, starting in verse 5, on the next day their rulers and elders and scribes gathered together in Jerusalem with Annas the high priest and Caiaphas. Now, isn't this interesting? You find the priesthoods with Annas and Caiaphas. Now, you've got a father and a son-in-law, and it's supposed to be passing on from there, but you always have Annas and Caiaphas. Annas is supposed to be the high priest, but I dare say that you have some political power there still with Caiaphas. And you got John and Alexander and all who are of the high priestly family. You've got the high priest, you got his family that are all being associated with this instance here. But then, and you've got the mention of the elders and the scribes and all those other groups. But I just want to focus on what the high priest is doing. And when they sat down, and when they had set them in the midst, they inquired, by what power or by what name did you do this? They're the ones that are, leading this charge against the apostles, and you can go on from there. But you can find this interaction with the high priest. It's the same thing with the story of Jesus. The main part of, the life of Jesus, that he's coming from Nazareth, this little town out in Galilee that nobody really cares about, and you find him kind of moving up the ladder of influence. And what I mean by that is he himself is getting the attention of people high up. When you read the book of Acts, we have already escalated beyond that point because we know Jesus was killed by the charges of the high priest and everything. So Christianity is on the radar of the high priest. Isn't that interesting how you go from, a carpenter's son all the way up to anyone that's in Christianity? They are already paying attention. They are being observed by the highest order in the Jewish religion. And they can't escape that. And so I think that's important to look at these stories. Let's look at chapter 5, verse 17, and we'll see this passage again in a different context. But the high priest rose up, and all who were with him, that is the party of the Sadducees, and filled with jealousy, they arrested the apostles and put them in public prison. So Christianity cannot escape from these high priests. And the high priest, all right, so think about it from a Jew's perspective. The high priest had the responsibility we're going to make sure that we are maintaining God's word. Now, they weren't doing a fantastic job of that, but let's say that they were following the statutes. They're saying, all right, we want to make sure there is no variation coming in. We're going to protect the belief system here. I can understand where they're coming from, right? You can understand what they're trying to do. But if they were going to be like, and we're going to see some examples of this, we've got a verse coming up next, some of the priests are going to convert to Christianity. These guys know the Word of God. They have to know the terms in order to help people. But think about how powerful that is, that as they're sitting there and Paul's preaching, eventually later on after this, but you got the apostles that are connecting dots. Things that they've already noticed because they know what the law, the prophet, and the Psalms teach about Jesus, because Jesus opened up their minds to understand that, is what we found in Luke chapter 24. They're sitting there and they're preaching across the table from them, and they're going through, or maybe they already have it memorized. They got their phylacteries with all the verses in there they've memorized, and they're connecting the dots. And they're thinking, Jesus said he's going to be a prophet. And the description of him looks a lot like Deuteronomy 18, where there's going to be a prophet who arises after Moses. They're looking at what Jesus was teaching, the apostles telling about it. And it looks a lot like what Jesus was saying about the Old Testament. In fact, why so many people are surprised at the authority of Jesus in his teaching is because things that the Jewish leaders had missed about the law, not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. It's kind of his, when he's going through the Sermon on the Mount, he kind of steps to the side and he's like, I'm not being heretical here. The things that I'm about to tell you, don't think that this is coming out of left field. You should know this by now. You have heard that it was said, but now I say to you. It was there the whole time. They had just missed it. So anytime you find interactions with the high priest and finding, the precedent set in Jesus and then continuing over, you find him addressing what they were doing and how to be better. In chapter 6, verse 7, and the word of God continued to increase, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. Now, when you read through the ministry of Jesus, like John chapter 12, you find people in these religious groups where they did not convert to Christianity because they cared too much about what the people thought. But here, you find them abandoning that way of thinking, and now they are part of the number, the believers confessing Christ. Chapter 7, verse 1. And the high priest said, "Are these things so?" And him questioning Stephen. Shortly after this, because we're going to get to chapter 8, you're not going to see as much about the high priest, and it's understandable because where are we going to be in the outline? We've gone from Acts 1, verse 8, right, where it says Jerusalem, Judea, what's the next stopping point? Samaria, which is what happens in Acts chapter 8. You're going to find the gospel message going to Samaria and then the ends of the earth. And so you're not really going to see the high priest bubble up as much toward the end of the book of Acts, and that's certainly understandable. So just giving you some things to look for. That's all I'm doing is when you read, look at when does the high priest appear and how is he acting? Those would be good questions. All right, we're the most familiar, I would say, with the varieties of Judaism when it comes to the Pharisees. These are a legalist group. A lot of times that is attached to them, and it's the party of the rabbis, the teachers that you find. I think Acts 23 is a good passage to exemplify what's going on here, but it also teaches us a little something about the Sadducees. Let's look at this scenario that happens with Paul in Acts chapter 23 when he's being questioned. Jesus does this same thing at times, by the way. Matthew 22 would be a good example. Maybe we'll flip over there in just a minute. But thinking about Acts 23, when when Paul is being questioned, he's going to pin the Pharisees and the Sadducees against one another. Somebody told me when it came time of defending a dissertation, in your PhD and a dissertation, that you've got a committee. You've got a guy that is your chair that's supposed to be on your side. He's the one that's proofed everything. He knows your argument. And then your committee members have not read and have not interacted as much with the content. And so when it comes time to defend it, you sit across the table from them, you give your thoughts. They're going to then have this line of reasoning toward you. And why'd you say this? Can you back it up? Okay, what sources did you use? That whole kind of thing. But somebody told me, hey, when it comes time for the dissertation defense, if you know what each one of your committee members believe, if you can lob something toward them and make them debate one another the whole time instead of questioning you, you're in a good place. And that's actually one of the things that happened in my time. But I've talked to other people who have defended their dissertation. They've done the same thing where they have pinned the committee against one another and they forget you're sitting there. So you get to sit back. The timer stops, and then they're going to have to decide where they go from there. That's what Paul does here in Acts 23. I think this is a very interesting tactic. Look at verse 6. Now, when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisee, so he knows his group, right? He knows where he is. He's here in Jerusalem. He knows their religion, and he knows their reasoning, okay? And so he sees these, and he cries out in the council, "Brothers, I'm a Pharisee, a son of the Pharisees." So he's going to get the Pharisees' attention. It's with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial. He's got the Sadducees' attention because they didn't believe in the resurrection. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. He's no longer on the hot seat. I think that's an excellent tactic. He's like, you know what? I'm here. I'm in jail. They're going to be persecuting me, and I'm going to have to go to Caesar. I mean, he knew what was going to happen from here. He's like, let's just have a little fun. And so he's going to take these two groups, and he's going to pin them against one another. And I think it's a great example, although we don't want to cause up dissensions and arguments in our Bible studies, right? But he knows the people that he's dealing with, and he's going to pin them against one another. And there's this whole division that's rising in verse 4. For this, the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisee party stood up and contended sharply. "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him?" And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. Can you see this playing out? Can you see this happening? And Paul's he's stirring them up, and they're even stirring one another up. They're like, I don't find anything wrong with this man. And then they're even using the same language, talking about, a spirit or an angel, which is what the Sadducees didn't agree with. So you have the Pharisees that are present in something like this, and we certainly have accounts of them in the time of Jesus. But if you can understand where they have come from, of how they came on the scene, and it happens in the intertestamental period. They're trying to be these pious people, and they're trying to understand the law, and they're trying to bind up and make sure that we are not being influenced by all the things that are happening culturally around them, which is what the Greek influence and Hellenism that we mentioned in passing, they were trying to protect that. So they said, okay, let's shore up Judaism and let's keep all of that outside of it. And that's where the traditions and stuff started coming from, because they want to make sure we're not having any extra influence. But then they focus too much on the tradition, the commandments of men, versus the Word of God. And the Sadducees, in contrast to them, they're aristocrats, which is why you find that mention of them, the high priest and those who are with him, and it says the Sadducees. They were a priestly party. They were rich, influential, and you find them all throughout the story. And so, once again, Acts chapter 5, 17 through 18, we made mention of. Another group of people during the first century are the Zealots. Now, there's not a lot in the book of Acts other than one mention in Acts 1, verse 13. How is zealot brought to us? Who is that associated with? You can read the answer in Acts chapter 1, verse 13. But one of the 12 apostles was a zealot. Does that just mean he was a zealous person? No, a zealot was somebody that was a radical and was militant against Roman influence. You find this very small group of people. Sometimes they have other names attached to them, which is why I'm giving you Acts chapter 21, verse 38. Paul is accused of being part of the assassin group, or the Sicarii, which is maybe part of these zealots. But they didn't like Rome in charge. Remember we talked about that, where Rome was actually in charge of Israel, of Palestine, that area, even having the Temple Mount with the Roman garrison off to the side. The Romans were in control. The Jews couldn't really do anything outside of the Romans giving approval. So the zealots are the ones that are like, man, we don't want them here. So they would actually infiltrate the Romans and try and assassinate political leaders and things like that. Very interesting, just historically. And there's not a lot in the book of Acts except for one of Jesus' apostles is a zealot, and Paul being accused potentially of being a part of one of these groups. And just historically, just because I like this kind of stuff, one of the reasons why Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD is because of the rebellion that happened against the Jews, against Rome, headed by the Jews with the zealots. The Romans finally got fed up with it and like, look, if you guys don't just leave us alone, stop trying to overthrow us, then we're going to overthrow you. We're going to take your little temple. We're going to walk into the midst of it, desecrate it, abomination, desolation type thing. We already seen precursors of that. But we're going to walk in here and we're going to destroy everything you've got. And if you read the histories, like Josephus, and he describes that specifically. And just because I like pictures, I'm just going to show you. Let's see. Get it pulled up here. I don't know if you've heard of this, the last stand that the Jews had, where the Jews were almost eradicated, at least in this area, because the Romans, they destroyed Jerusalem. A lot of people got away. A small number of the Jews ran away to a place down toward the Dead Sea, which is called Masada. It's very beautiful. Herod the Great built a temple on the side of it. It's this big rock outcropping. Hope that shows up right. It's a big rock outcropping. It's a little dark, you'll be able to see it, but right here at the edge pointing toward me. I guess my battery's dead. Sorry. But the edge pointing toward me, you actually find a 3-tiered palace that Herod built on the edge of it, overlooking the valley. Pretty interesting, but there was a little pig trail that went up the side of the mountain, and that's how people would get up there. But there was a whole community, and that's where the last stand against where the Jews ran up there. This was going to be their last stand, so the Romans said, we're just really tired of you. So the Romans, in Roman fashion, do you know how they got to the top? Because if you were going up that little pig trail with all of your Roman soldiers, they could just, bombard you from the top. You couldn't get up there. So you know what the Romans did? I don't know if this is going to show up. They just built a mountain next to their mountain. That white line that looks like another ridge, the Romans just piled up dirt to be able to get to the top, and they had siege works that they had pushed toward the top. So eventually they got to the top, but before they got there, everybody on top committed suicide. But by Roman fashion, you could just see them saying, we'll make it up there, don't you worry. I just think that's interesting historically. The Zealots, although I think the apostles, they left from that. I don't think they were part of these rules. But just give you a little bit of context to the content. All right, so as we come back, there's one other group here. The Essenes, they're not mentioned specifically in the Bible, but they're kind of this little divergent group of Judaism. We know them because of Josephus, but because of the Dead Sea Qumran community, we learn a lot about what they practiced and what they believed. And it was a divergent group, but still interesting in and of itself. The last few people groups that you find in the book of Acts, you find the Samaritans. Okay? I'm wording it this way. They were not included in the lost sheep of the house of Israel, because when Jesus was interacting with a Samaritan woman, he says in Matthew 15, 21 through 28, he says, I only came to the lost sheep of Israel, as in interacting with the Samaritan woman. And he was drawing her over, and of course he takes care of her, and that's why I gave you the full context, Matthew 15, 21 through 28. But as he's interacting with her, he's telling her, look, the Samaritans are a little bit different. You find Jesus interacting with the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. But you also find the Samaritans as being a major part of the spread of the gospel. In Acts chapter 8, right, starting in verse 1, when people left they left Jerusalem because of all the persecutions, they went to Samaria. And you find a thriving church in Samaria. In fact, if you look at some of the other mentions of it, it talks about a church being in Galilee and Samaria and Antioch. It was one of the main places where Christianity was thriving. And you find the reception of these people who had kind of been considered outcasts, unacceptable. Jesus started opening up that door for them. The apostles learning how to take care of them. You know, the apostles had to go beyond, all right, we're going to strike down this city with fire. And Jesus was like, no. That's not how we're going to interact with these people. He wanted to lead them over. But you find the Samaritans in the book of Acts. You find Gentiles, this generic group, those outside of Judaism. You find them coming over and believing in God. In fact, in Acts chapter 9, one of the mission statements of Paul, when Jesus is speaking about him to Ananias before he comes along to have a conversation with Paul in Damascus, says that Paul is to be a missionary to the Gentiles. And he spends his time on that. And you can find him in Acts chapter 13 when he's just fed up with the Jews. That's a very interesting sermon. He's fed up with the Jews and he says, fine, from this point on, I'm just going to the Gentiles, because they actually receive the word of God a lot quicker than other people. You find these Hellenists. These are not just people that have Greek influence, Hellene being a Greek word to describe the Greeks. Hellenists are Greek-speaking Jews. You're probably familiar with them in Acts chapter 6, verse 1, where the Greek widows, Greek-speaking widows, were being neglected in the daily distribution, which is how big Christianity was growing, that they started having a food distribution center, essentially. But you find other examples of people like this in chapter 9, verse 29, and 11, verse 20, that Paul went specifically and spoke to the Hellenists. You know, culturally, this is important. They're speaking Greek. They're not speaking Aramaic, which is what all the other Jews would be speaking. So what do they believe? Religiously, we don't really know, but they're their own people group, okay, just because of a differentiation of language. Proselytes, these are people who are converted over to Judaism from the Gentile way of living. You find the first mention of them, at least in the book of Acts, in chapter 2, verses 10 through 11. There are people there on the day of Pentecost, proselytes being there. But also chapter 6, verse 5, one of the men who is selected to serve, so the apostles can continue to preach and they need somebody to serve tables. In Acts chapter 6, you find a proselyte, but he had come over to Christianity. Do you see the steps that we're going from here? You've got somebody that was a Gentile that moved over to Judaism that is now a Christian. It's like where, in how many steps or in how many notes can you name that tune? If you're going to go from Judaism to Christianity, or you're going to go from being a Gentile to a Christian, do you go by way of Judaism, or do you go by way of something else? But how do you get from this point to this point? That's what I think we're trying to accomplish, what I'm trying to highlight at least here. How'd you get to Jesus? And if we can understand what these individual people did, then we can start creating in our minds a process for when we walk out these doors and we're sitting across the table, we're sitting a cubicle over, or we interact with somebody at a store. Just somebody I ran a text the other day that said, hey, I met somebody at Costco. I want you to pray about this conversation. I started a Bible study with them. How do you go from a cashier that you interact with for a few seconds to having a Bible study? I think it comes down to somebody that's like a God-fearer. Cornelius and his household were among these kind of people. And then the last group, you have people that just walked away from Judaism. The Herodians would be a main group of that. So these are your people groups. These are your different cultures that you can find in the book of Acts. But let's let the rubber hit the road next week, and we'll wrap up our context to the content.